Good morning, everybody. I'm Molly Solomon, KQED's housing reporter and co-host of the housing podcast, Sold Out, Rethinking Housing in America. I want to welcome you to our main stage panel this morning, Lessons and Innovations from Local Communities. For the next session, we're going to hear some specific policy proposals for creating more equitable housing opportunities. Affordable homes for Black and Brown households continue to languish behind the national average. New economic hardships triggered by the pandemic compound historic challenges to those marginalized communities. In this context, housing stakeholders are working toward equitable housing policies and wealth building opportunities for all households, especially for low-income households of color. Throughout our conversation today, we're going to be posting some useful conference information into the chat window, like where to find bios, the schedule, and different panel descriptions for later today. We're going to start with hearing some perspectives from the Partnership for the Bay's Future Policy Fund and family of loan funds. Unfortunately, we won't be able to answer questions in real time, but if you drop them in the chat, we'll make sure that we get to those answers at a later date. To keep things rolling, I'm actually going to turn over introductions to the panelists themselves. So go ahead and introduce yourself. Tell us a little bit about what brings you to this work. And I'll go ahead and start with Aisha.
Thank you so much, Molly. And hi, everybody. I'm really happy and excited to share this space with you all today. As Molly mentioned, my name is Aisha Pamaku. I lead the Policy Fund, which is the key policy arm of the Partnership for the Bay's Future. Our work is focused on using community-driven policy to advance equitable housing solutions throughout the region. So that means we're investing in local communities and their ability to be a beacon of policy innovation to the region and the state. And this makes a lot of sense because time and again, we've seen local governments and communities be the vanguards of housing solutions and policy solutions. And on a personal note, I think that like so many of us, my connection to this work is not just on a professional level. I like to say that I'm from the Bay Area by way of the Philippines and by way of Turkey, which is where my parents are from. I was actually born and raised here in the Bay Area, and I'm raising my own family here. David spoke so movingly about the American dream, and my family has really seen how the Bay Area can be a place of welcome, can be a place of opportunity, but we are also seeing that our story of multiple generations calling the Bay Area home is becoming increasingly more of a rare thing. And I want to be part of changing that.
Hi, everyone. My name is Asha Rao. I'm the Director of Investments for Bay Area LISC. LISC is fund manager for the Family of Loan Funds and the Partnership for the Bay's Future. And the Family of Loan Funds consists of the Bay's Future Fund and the Community Housing Fund, both of which finance affordable multifamily rental housing in the 5-county Bay Area region. Personally, the work around housing equity continues to compel me as I've seen the inequities in the Bay Area grow even in the short amount of time that I've had the opportunity to live here. And I'd like to work towards finding solutions for that.
Thank you both so much for being here today. So I want to start, big picture. This is a partnership that launched 2 years ago, 2019. And there were some pretty ambitious housing goals, and there was also $500 million investment here. I want to hear from both of you. What lessons have you learned at this point in the partnership?
Yeah, I can start with some of the lessons we've learned from the launch of the loan funds. I'd like to highlight two main lessons actually that we've really taken away from this past year of our work. And that would be one, that there is a need and demand for truly low cost and flexible capital. We all know this, of course, but putting into action has been the hard part and has really been the work this past year. I'll frame up the two loan funds first for those who are less familiar. It consists of the Bay's Future Fund and the Community Housing Fund, as I had mentioned before, both of which finance affordable multifamily rental housing in the 5-county region. The Bay's Future Fund's reach is broader. It offers 5 products that span different areas of the affordable housing market, from a product focused on faith-based developers to one that focuses on workforce housing. with AMIs ranging anywhere from 20 to 150%. The Community Housing Fund, on the other hand, is more targeted. It launched in December with a $150 million commitment from Facebook and in partnership with Destination Home and LISC. It has a specific focus on extremely low-income communities, which are those communities earning 30% of area median income or less. With this focus on these vulnerable communities, who often have higher needs, the projects are more expensive and more difficult to execute. So as a result, the terms of the fund enable those projects and are set up to enable those projects. As a result, the fund offers a 2% fixed interest rate, higher LTVs, longer terms, and the ability to be subordinate. But really, both funds offer products that flex beyond what the CDFI lenders involved would normally offer, which are higher LTVs, lower debt service coverage ratios, and lower rates. And both funds have honestly seen a lot of demand. The Bay's Future Fund, its strength and its uniqueness lies in its ability to react to the needs of the market. And that really is to be flexible. And it was set up this way. So for example, we recently expanded one of the loan products in the fund to cover rehab-only loans, as our partners had told us that that was a need in the market that was not being met. And the fund continues to evolve. Right now, we're considering transitional housing as a new use to add to the fund. The Community Housing Fund's strength is its focus on ELI, which is an area of the market that was not being well served prior to the pandemic, and frankly has experienced new hardship as a result of it, particularly our communities of color. In developing the fund, the group involved saw the need for ELI housing growing exponentially as a result of the pandemic environment and steered the fund towards its current focus on ELI communities. And as I mentioned earlier, in order to enable ELI projects, the terms of the fund needed to be aggressive. So a 2% rate is offered, high LTVs, longer terms, and subordination. As a result, this loan fund is extremely flexible and reactive to the market needs. I'll go to the second lesson here, that I like to talk about, which is technical assistance, and how technical assistance has been equally as important as the terms of the financing. The projects that come to the two funds have often had unique challenges or obstacles, even for the CDFI space, which already serves customers that banks will not. And as a quick reminder, the three CDFIs involved are LISC, Capital Impact Partners, and CSH. All of us have a deep history of lending to affordable housing projects. With these two loan funds, our goal was to go even deeper, to support projects that might have had trouble sourcing financing even from these same CDFIs in the first place. And we've had demonstrated success with that, from supporting emerging developers who've completed their first projects with us, to community land trusts preserving housing, or even financing a modular construction deposit. We've combined deep technical assistance with the flexibility of the loan capital to be responsive in our approach to developing more housing in the Bay Area.
Thank you so much, Asha. Aisha, what lessons have you learned?
Oh, wow. We've learned a lot this year. And I think a lot of it comes down to the importance of relationships. And in particular, really having strong, trusting relationships between the folks who are in local government and the nonprofit leaders who are the ones who have deep grassroots connection to community. And what we knew going into this and what we have seen confirmed again and again is that relationships are foundational to successful policy efforts. Relationships are what allow us to make progress as a community and really make sure that our efforts are reflecting our values. And relationships are the things that help us center those who are most affected by the housing crisis. So folks who earn very low incomes, people of color, people who are renters. And that's why the policy fund model works to build and strengthen relationships along what we call an inside-outside spectrum. And by that, I just mean strengthening relationships between those staff who work inside of government and the community partner organizations who are outside the government and in community. The policy fund model supports leaders from local communities along this inside-outside spectrum to work together to advance equitable housing policies. And as context, Molly, the Policy Fund launched our inaugural program last year called the Challenge Grants. And you're going to hear more from some of our amazing Challenge Grant team later today. But just as a preview, the Challenge Grant program brings together a cohort of housing champions from across the Bay Area, representing 6 cities and 1 county. And again, you'll hear more of their stories later today. And as you might imagine, to have a gross understatement, it was not ideal to launch a pilot program of an experimental model of government community policy collaboration in the middle of a pandemic. But again, it really did underscore the importance of relationships and connection, ironically, or maybe even especially at a time when we all had to adapt to living at a distance from each other. And so I'll just highlight maybe a couple key things that the relationships we've built and fostered have enabled us to do. And I think the first and most immediate is the Challenge Grant relationships are helping us move forward the policies that are needed today. So these are policies that run a whole range of tenant protection and affordable housing preservation efforts, things like just cause evictions, rent registries, supporting community land trusts, and policies that help community members stay in their homes and neighborhoods. And a key aspect of this work is really bringing to the table folks who don't usually have this level of access to the nuts and bolts of the policymaking process. And it can be really mundane sometimes, everything from which staff members to turn to how do policies make it to committee agendas, or even just when hearings are calendared. And then the second thing that we're really hearing about is how the relationships we're building are changing how policy is done in the future. The Challenge Grant team is working to transform the policymaking process so that it's even more inclusive and community driven. And we're seeing that our local government teams are really strengthening their ability to work on community driven, sometimes even community drafted policies. And you'll be hearing more from some of our team members about this later today. And last, the relationships are not just about resourcing folks who are in local communities, it's connecting folks across those local communities to each other on a regional scale. So we're really building a regional community of practice, and I'm really excited to see where that goes.
Yeah, so much exciting work is coming out of this. I want to know a little bit about some of the impact and the effects of these different funds and policies that the partnership is pushing toward. How have these specific funds made a difference in the lives of these communities that we're talking about, especially for folks that are low income and communities of color?
Absolutely. And again, it's really important for us that we are centering those who are the most impacted by the housing crisis. And because of that, the Policy Fund is focused on local policy efforts that are working to stem the tide of displacement and make sure that our communities continue to be the diverse and vibrant places that we love. And so that means adopting and implementing policies, again, that really center the needs of those at most risk for displacement. And I think 2 good examples of that work are actually live policy campaigns from some team members that we'll be hearing from later today. One is at the local level and one's at the state level. So one example that I'll highlight is in Berkeley, there's currently a campaign for a Tenant Opportunity to Purchase Act, or TOPA. And this is a policy that gives renters essentially first dibs on collectively purchasing a rental property when it goes up for sale. And it makes that property affordable in the long term. And what does that mean practically? It means that the people who already call Berkeley home will have a policy in place that helps them remain part of the fabric of that community. It means there's one less factor that is pushing renters out of their homes and communities. And coming back to an earlier theme, it wouldn't have happened without the relationships involved. The mayor's office worked closely with the East Bay Community Law Center, who drafted the policy, and Healthy Black Families led critical outreach and community engagement. So the language of that policy really reflects community priorities and values. And then the other example I'll highlight is San Jose supporting state legislation, SB 649. And this is state policy that would support local tenant preferences for lower income households who face displacement risk. It would allow developers who receive certain types of public funds to prioritize those at risk of displacement and most in need of stable housing. We already prioritize certain groups like teachers, like the elderly. So this is something that makes a lot of sense. And what does it mean practically? You know, again, it means not just in San Jose, but in communities across the state, local residents who are at risk for displacement can receive the badly needed prioritization to help them continue living in their communities, continue being part of the fabric of those communities. And, you know, I think the reason that it's so important that we're pursuing policy solutions is because, you know, as Ruby talked about earlier on, policy solutions for so long have been part of the problem. You know, communities today are still feeling the effects of generations of racial segregation, generations of redlining that just siphoned resources right out of certain neighborhoods. And so you can't separate housing solutions from racial and economic justice. And we're really at a pivotal moment where people are coming together to use policy, not just to recover, but to reimagine what kind of region we want to be.
Asha, how about you? How have you seen the funds make a difference for the communities and the families that you're trying to help?
Yeah, thank you for this question. I believe too, it's really important to be able to demonstrate the impact of the financing versus just talking about the financing itself. So I'd say at a high level, the two loan funds are designed to provide quality, affordable housing focused on low-income communities. In particular, the Community Housing Fund has a specific focus on those communities that are most vulnerable, those earning 30% AMI or less. There's nothing more fundamental than a stable roof over one's head. It drives all kinds of outcomes from health, safety, schooling, the list goes on and on. But I'll focus on one specific example of the impact that the funds had out of the Base Future Fund. The Community Housing Fund was recently launched, so those projects are still in process. So I'll focus on this example, which is the 12th Avenue in Oakland. The Bay Area Community Land Trust, which is a land trust located in the East Bay, they came to us requesting funds to purchase an existing 6-unit property in Oakland. The tenants, all low income, had organized against an absent landlord who would allow the building to slip into extreme disrepair. They wanted the land trust to buy the building and then allow them to have a say in how it was run, which is something that they had not had the opportunity to do before this moment. And the Base Future Fund was able to do that for them and for the land trust, enabling the land trust to purchase the building. Now the building will finally be rehabbed, the much needed rehab that it needs. And then the tenants there will have a safe, affordable place to call home as long as they need it. And that's just one example of many that the funds have been involved in.
That's great to hear really specific examples as well, you know, bringing up the 12th Street example in Oakland. So thank you both. I want to know, Aisha, you had brought up earlier in one of your answers that you really had to adapt to, you know, what's happened over the past year, the pandemic. I want to know how has, maybe more specifically, how has the policy fund had to deal with that new challenge of, you know, really trying to implement this in the COVID-19 environment that we're all living in and experiencing?
Yeah, that was a lot for our partners to deal with. I mean, we really had a public health crisis colliding with a longstanding housing crisis, and all of this happening against the backdrop of the largest civil rights mobilization, certainly that any of us have ever seen in our lifetime. So I think, you know, Molly, to your point, one of the key learnings for us were really around adaptability and being able to hold two things at once, which is meeting the immediate needs of communities while also looking forward to the future we want to build. Right? We see that things shift a lot during moments of crisis, both for better and worse. We learned about how to show up for our partners who were in emergency response mode, right? Housing needs were so acute and folks had to respond with what was needed in the moment. So direct aid, rental assistance, or even things as simple but important as what is accessible, trustworthy information about the resources that are available to people. And then on the other hand, we had to support our partners in maintaining the line of sight for the policy goals that we started with at the outset. And I think then throughout all of that context, we have seen the community organizing and engagement landscape just shift so radically. And I think our partners are really still grappling with what exactly meeting folks where they are and community engagement and organizing looks today, in this continued remote context. And I think that the other real critical learning was about the need for swift and visionary action during a crisis. I mentioned that, right, when we are in moments of crisis, we see that things are exposed, truths about our system, and also the ways that our systems will shift one way or the other. And I think COVID, again, quite an understatement, really exposed the deep flaws in so many of our systems. And it doesn't matter if you're talking about housing or healthcare. And for a long time, I think so many of us were hearing this, right? There was this talk of returning to normal, but so many of us, and certainly all of our partners in the policy fund, are saying the status quo wasn't good enough, and we can and should do better. And there's so many people who can't go back to normal. It's not an option for them, right? Renters who have been out of a job and are staring at an eviction cliff, they can't go back to normal. Families who have been displaced from their neighborhoods can't go back to normal. Folks who are making impossible economic choices with the resources they have can't go back to normal. So I think we are at such a important moment of opportunity where we can change and improve the policies that govern how we build and manage housing. And the way we get there is by investing in our partners in local government and making sure that those folks are connected with the people power that is in our communities. And so, I think these are times when the things that we used to say were impossible suddenly became possible. And it's about us capitalizing those moments and continuing that progress, right? We're helping renters experiencing hardship on a massive scale. We've repurposed vacant hotels for emergency shelter. And so I think it's about how do we build on the truths that we've exposed and the progress that has happened under incredibly adverse circumstances.
Yeah, I mean, if there's so much to take away from this past year, and I think that it's both underscored the importance of home, but really revealed a lot of the inequalities that are baked into and have been there, long before this pandemic in our housing structures. Here in the Bay Area, especially, where there is such income inequality, and you really see that play out. For you, Asha, kind of tied to this, a lot of the work that comes out of the family loan funds, there's a real targeted investment, in affordable housing, but really looking at building affordable housing for people who might really need it the most, especially for low-income communities, households of color. I want to know more about how you build this housing and more housing, but looking at it through a racial equity lens.
And this is a core question that the loan funds are working to answer right now. How do we build more housing through a racial equity lens? We've put in place tracking for what we've called equity impact metrics. And this includes tracking the race and or ethnicity of our borrowers' staff, leadership, and boards, and of the tenants, ideally, who will eventually live in the projects or who are already living in them. By collecting and measuring this data, we're building a baseline of the Bay Area housing market. Who gets to call these projects home, and who are the developers who are working to enable that? The goal is to have this data feed back into our strategy so that we can refine outreach, such as reaching more BIPOC developers, for example, or developing incremental changes in our housing product suite. For example, we've already learned in the early collection of our data that for the housing preservation deals, over 90% of the tenants are from communities of color. This is a huge number. We can then begin to develop a possible thesis or idea that housing preservation could be the most cost-effective and efficient way to develop housing through a racial equity lens. Another important facet that I'd like to mention to this discussion is capacity building. For example, if we want to lend to more diverse developers who bring this housing to the market, which I often hear as an industry goal, then we need to have a part in helping to develop that pipeline of diverse developers. Building multifamily affordable housing, as we all know, is an expensive endeavor. It works against those who do not already have established wealth, connections, or deep experience. Programs that focus on building the capacity of emerging BIPOC developers in particular, so that they too can bring projects to the market, are essential. As these developers often from their communities often know what's best, what are the best types of projects to bring. And we've already started seeing some of those proposals come to the space that focus on minority developers. By coming at the goal of developing housing through a racial equity lens from several angles, I think only then can we begin to move the needle towards our goal.
I want to know from both of you, in terms of moving the needle, especially, just how can we go beyond a fund built on donations from businesses or philanthropic dollars? How can, we actually create a more permanent source of funding for housing and to keep building the type of housing that we need the most?
Well, from a financing perspective, the Base Future Fund was seeded with grant capital from CZI, but a significant amount of the lending capital came from investors. And that lending capital is expected to be repaid and has an expected return, although that return is below market rate. So in exchange for that below market rate return, investors are seeking impact that is innovative and transformative. The same goes for the Community Housing Fund in terms of repayment and return to the investor, and combined with grant capital from Destination Home and LISC. While I honestly think there will always be a place and need for grant capital in the affordable housing industry, the two loan funds show that when combined with investor capital, philanthropy can be leveraged up to maximize the impact of those precious grant dollars to create housing. Eventually, though, I personally would love to see the industry move towards being able to better quantify the dollar value of the impact that comes out of affordable housing and incorporate that into the return that investors could consider. And that would involve, of course, education and work with the investors to quantify as well. If that could be successfully done, we could reduce the reliance on a strictly financial return and ideally reduce reliance on philanthropic dollars to protect that same financial return.
And I know we're coming up on time, so I'll keep my reflection brief, but I think as just some framing, I think it's important to acknowledge that so much of the funding for affordable housing comes from the federal level. And that, of course, as a lot of us have been seeing, the federal government has been retracting this funding with, at least so far, not a lot of signs of meaningfully replacing it. And this has cost thousands of affordable units. And so in that context, I think it's important to frame what we're doing as, in no way being a replacement for significant investment by the federal government, but we are stepping into that space, as Asha was talking about, and saying that our region and our local communities can lead and can be a model to the state and the rest of the country. And I think, we're also saying that obviously funding is essential, but it's also not the whole puzzle. Another really big piece is the cross-sector collaboration that we're working on, and bringing community voice into the picture. And I think if you pair that with aggressive funding solutions, you get to the systems change that we need to see. And I also just wanted to, of course, highlight that regionally, we obviously have some really exciting innovations, especially the Bay Area Housing Finance Authority. And one of its key features is being able to raise significant new funding across all the 3 Ps. So also want to highlight not just what we're doing locally, but regionally to really innovate in this space.
Thank you. Thank you both so much. We are running up on time, and I just want to say Thank you so much to Asha, Aisha, for sharing these lessons that you've learned and the different innovative ways that you are using these funds to actually get them out to the community. So appreciate you taking the time to talk with us for this panel today. Thank you both so much.
Thank
Thank
you,
you.
Molly.